Eliza Johnson, invited to play piano at a fancy Boston party, faces hidden racism from wealthy guests expecting her to fail. Her brilliant performance turns their mockery into amazement. The Wellington estate glowed against Boston's skyline, where wealthy guests in designer attire shared champagne and practiced laughter. Eliza Johnson stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, unconsciously smoothing the fabric of her simple, black dress. At 32, the accomplished concert pianist had performed on stages across Europe and Asia, yet she found herself more nervous here than before any concert. Her recent relocation to Boston meant rebuilding her professional network. From scratch, a task her brother Marcus had insisted required attendance at events like this fundraiser for the city's youth arts program. "These are the people who fund the arts in this city," Marcus had told her the night before. "I know it's not your scene, but one evening could open doors that would otherwise remain closed." Now, watching the predominantly white gathering of Boston's elite, Eliza questioned her brother's wisdom. Her modest attire, selected to be appropriate rather than attention-seeking, stood in stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. Women draped in jewelry worth more than her grand piano circulated the room, while men in bespoke suits discussed yacht clubs and investment portfolios. Thomas Wellington, the evening's host, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. In his early 60s, the real estate magnate had cultivated a reputation as a patron of the arts, though Eliza had heard whispers that his philanthropy was more about tax benefits than genuine passion. "Eliza Johnson, what a pleasant surprise," came a voice to her right. Dr. Claire Bennett, a professor from the Boston Conservatory, approached with a glass of champagne. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she offered nothing more than a cordial nod before being pulled away by another guest. From across the room, Sophia Hartley's gaze fixed on Eliza with the intensity of someone who had identified an unwelcome intruder. Sophia, the widow of a banking executive and a fixture in Boston's social scene, whispered something to her companion while maintaining eye contact with Eliza. Both women smiled in a way that made Eliza's skin prickle. Gathering her composure, Eliza moved toward the refreshment table where she was intercepted by Sophia. "I don't believe we've met," Sophia said, her voice honeyed but her eyes cold. "I'm Sophia Hartley. I must say, these events are typically by invitation only. Thomas is quite selective about his guest list." The implication hung in the air between them. Before Eliza could respond, Sophia continued, "It's just so refreshing to see new faces in our circle, especially those bringing diversity to our gatherings. Tell me, how did you come to receive an invitation? Do you work for one of the catering companies?" Eliza felt her pulse quicken as conversations nearby quieted, several guests turning to observe the interaction. At that moment, she understood exactly why her brother had insisted she come. Not despite the potential for such encounters, but because of them. Eliza excused herself from Sophia's presence with as much dignity as she could muster, retreating to a quiet corner near an enormous arrangement of white lilies. Their cloying scent did little to mask the discomfort spreading through her chest. From this vantage point, she could observe the room while appearing engrossed in the artwork on the walls. "Another diversity initiative, I imagine," came a male voice from a nearby cluster of guests. Though they weren't looking in her direction, Eliza knew the comment was about her. Wellington probably invited her to satisfy some board requirement. These institutions are so concerned with appearances these days. "Did you catch her name?" "Johnson, I believe." "Never heard of her," replied another voice. "And I'm quite familiar with everyone of note in the classical music circuit." Eliza closed her eyes momentarily, and unbidden, memories surfaced from her childhood in Baltimore. The second-hand upright piano her parents had purchased from a church rummage sale, its middle C sticking slightly in humid weather. Her father came home from his second job as a night security guard, exhausted but still taking time to listen to her practice. Her mother mends her concert clothes by hand to make them last another season, unwilling to compromise on Eliza's appearance at recitals despite their limited means. She remembered practicing scales until her fingers ached, the metronome ticking away relentlessly as she worked to achieve perfection. While other children played outside, Eliza had chosen to stay indoors, drawn to the instrument that both tormented and fulfilled her. "You must practice twice as hard to be considered half as good," her first teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, had told her. At the time, Eliza hadn't fully understood the weight of those words. The memory shifted to her first major competition at 16. Despite receiving the highest technical scores, she'd placed third. One judge had later approached her mother, explaining in hushed tones that some on the panel felt audiences might not connect with Eliza's interpretation of European classical compositions. Her mind continued its journey backward, recalling her scholarship interview at Juilliard, where an administrator had asked if she wouldn't be more comfortable in a jazz program. The subtle redirections, the opportunities that mysteriously disappeared, the conductors who expressed surprise at her unexpected talent, all while her white peers progressed with seemingly effortless support from the establishment. Even after her breakthrough performance with the Berlin Philharmonic 5 years ago, critics had described her playing as surprisingly nuanced and unexpectedly sophisticated, as if her understanding of Chopin should have been limited by the color of her skin. A burst of laughter pulled Eliza back to the present. The Wellington estate, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, suddenly felt too similar to those concert halls and competition venues where she'd always been the outsider. Classical music requires not only technical proficiency, but cultural context. Sophia's voice carried across the room. She stood beside the Steinway grand piano that occupied the center of the adjoining music room, holding court among a group of attentive guests. One must understand the historical and societal influences that shaped each composition to truly capture its essence. Eliza felt herself being watched and turned to find Thomas Wellington approaching, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He offered one to her with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Johnson, I hope you're enjoying yourself," he said. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Thomas Wellington." "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Wellington," Eliza replied, accepting the champagne but not drinking it. "Your home is beautiful. Indeed. I've spent decades cultivating not just the space, but what fills it." His gaze drifted toward the music room. "I noticed you listening to Sophia. She's quite knowledgeable about classical music, sits on the board of the symphony. Do join us." Before Eliza could decline, his hand was at her elbow, guiding her toward the gathering. She sensed the trap closing, but saw no graceful way to escape it. "Ah, here she is," Wellington announced as they joined the circle. "Miss Johnson, Sophia was just discussing the emotional depth required to properly interpret Romantic-era compositions." Sophia's eyebrows arched slightly. "Indeed. We were specifically discussing Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies, and how one must understand the Magyar folk influences to truly capture their spirit." "An interesting perspective," Eliza replied neutrally. "Do you play, Miss Johnson?" Sophia asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer was no. "She must," interjected Wellington, before Eliza could respond. Anyone who received an invitation to tonight's fundraiser would certainly have some connection to the arts. The circle had grown larger now, with more guests drifting over, sensing the potential for entertainment. "Perhaps you might favor us with a demonstration," Wellington continued, gesturing toward his Steinway. "I just had it tuned last week, specifically for tonight's gathering." "Oh, Thomas," Sophia said with exaggerated concern. "Not everyone is comfortable performing in front of an audience. Perhaps Miss Johnson enjoys music as an appreciator rather than a practitioner." Several guests exchanged knowing glances. One man poorly disguised his smirk behind a sip of whiskey. "I insist," Wellington pressed. "Nothing formal, a simple tune would suffice. Something accessible." The implication was clear. He expected her capabilities to be limited. Eliza felt a familiar tightness in her chest. How many times had she faced this exact scenario? The setup for failure, the anticipated humiliation, the reinforcement of preconceived notions about her abilities based on nothing more than her appearance. She caught sight of Dr. Bennett at the periphery of the group, watching with visible discomfort, but remaining silent. Their eyes met briefly, and Eliza saw recognition there, not just of her as a person, but of the situation unfolding. In her mind, Eliza heard the voice of Dr. James Morris, her mentor from her conservatory days. "There will be people who want to see you fail because your success challenges their worldview. In those moments, remember that your talent speaks, a language more eloquent than their prejudice. Let your fingers do the talking." She stood at a crossroads. Walk away and preserve her dignity, but confirm their expectations, or accept the challenge and potentially walk into a trap. Either choice felt like a concession. Wellington's hand was on her shoulder now, gently but insistently guiding her toward the piano. "Come now, don't be shy. We're all friends here." The crowd parted as they approached the magnificent instrument. Its polished ebony surface reflected the chandelier light like a dark mirror. Perhaps something simple, a folk tune or pop song, Wellington suggested as Eliza stood before the piano. "No need to attempt anything too ambitious." A subtle wave of tittering spread through the onlookers. Sophia's smile was triumphant, anticipating the awkwardness to follow. Eliza placed her champagne glass on a nearby table and slowly removed her modest silver bracelet, the only jewelry she wore that evening. The action was deliberate, part of her pre-performance ritual that normally took place in green rooms before stepping onto stages around the world. As she seated herself at the bench, adjusting its height with practiced familiarity, she noticed the momentary confusion that flickered across Wellington's face. She placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, and took a deep breath. In this moment of suspended time, memories cascaded through her mind, her first recital at age 7, her mother's sacrifices, the rejection letters, the standing ovations, the critics who could never separate their assessment of her playing from their surprise at her identity. Each experience had hardened her resolve, yet softened her touch, infusing her music with a depth born from navigating two worlds that rarely welcomed her complete self. The room had fallen silent, the audience expecting, at best, a halting rendition of chopsticks or something equally elementary. Eliza closed her eyes, and for a moment, she wasn't in Wellington's mansion, but alone with the universe that existed between the keys, the place where she had always found her truest voice. Eliza's fingers hovered above the keys for what felt like an eternity. The weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders as heavily as it had throughout her career. The silent demand to prove herself yet again, to justify her presence in spaces others entered without question. The gleaming Steinway before her was superior to many she had played professionally, its action perfectly regulated, its voice resonant and pure. A hush had fallen over the gathering. Thomas Wellington stood with arms crossed, a satisfied smirk, playing at the corners of his mouth as he anticipated her inevitable failure. Sophia had positioned herself prominently, prepared to offer condescending encouragement after what she assumed would be a mediocre performance. Eliza took a measured breath, centering herself. Then, without preamble, her hands descended. The opening. Salvo of Chopin's revolutionary etude erupted from the piano, a cascading waterfall of notes that demanded absolute technical precision and emotional intensity. The choice was deliberate, a piece born of political turmoil and defiance, composed by Chopin after the failed Polish uprising against Russian rule. A statement of rebellion disguised as music. The room collectively inhaled. Wellington's smirk vanished, replaced by confusion. This was not the hesitant plunking he had expected. Eliza's left hand delivered the thunderous bass line with controlled power, while her right executed the rapid, intricate passages with crystalline clarity. Each note rang with purpose, each phrase built upon the last with architectural precision. Her body swayed slightly as she leaned into the more forceful sections, then became almost still during the delicate transitions. A woman near the back of the room set her champagne flute down with excessive care, as if afraid the slightest sound might shatter the spell being woven. A distinguished gentleman with silver hair closed his eyes, his head nodding almost imperceptibly with the rhythm. As Eliza navigated the complex middle section, her mind flashed to her first performance of this piece at a competition in Chicago. She had been 17, the youngest finalist, and the only black contestant. The judges had been skeptical until her fingers touched the keys. She channeled that same energy now, her technical prowess serving as the foundation for the emotional narrative she constructed. Dr. Claire Bennett, who had been watching from the periphery, suddenly moved forward. Recognition dawned across her features, and she gripped the arm of the man beside her. "That's Eliza Johnson," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed room despite her attempt at discretion. "Eliza Johnson. She performed with the London Philharmonic last season. Her interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Third was on the cover of Classical Review." The man's eyebrows shot upward. "The pianist who received the Avery Fisher Prize last year." "Here!" The whispers spread like ripples in still water, gaining momentum as the piece progressed. Guests leaned toward one another, exchanging shocked glances and hurried confirmations. The atmosphere transformed from patronizing anticipation to stunned admiration. Thomas Wellington's face underwent a remarkable metamorphosis. The initial confusion gave way to comprehension, then embarrassment, and finally a desperate attempt to appear appreciative rather than mortified. He adjusted his stance, uncrossing his arms and adopting the posture of someone deeply moved by the performance he had, of course, expected all along. Sophia made a subtle move toward the exit, but found herself unable to leave. Despite her attempts to maintain composure, her expression betrayed her discomfort. She had positioned herself as an authority, only to be confronted with genuine mastery. As Eliza approached the final section of the etude, she made a decision. Rather than concluding with Chopin's composed ending, she executed a seamless transition into her own composition, Ancestral Echoes. The piece that had earned her standing ovations at Carnegie Hall and had been commissioned by the Berlin Philharmonic for their centennial celebration. The music shifted from European classical tradition to something more personal, still technically complex but infused with subtle jazz harmonies and rhythmic patterns that echoed her heritage. The composition told her story, the struggle, the perseverance, the triumph, without compromise. In her mind, Eliza was simultaneously in Wellington's opulent music room and on the world's great stages. She saw the audience at Carnegie Hall rising to their feet as the final notes faded. She felt the warm handshake of the Japanese emperor after her performance at the Imperial Palace. She heard the thunderous applause in Amsterdam's Concertgebouw, where critics had hailed her as a once-in-a-generation talent. The music spoke of barriers encountered and overcome, of beauty created despite resistance, of claiming space in a world that often sought to diminish her. It was technically brilliant, but emotionally authentic, vulnerable, yet powerful. A movement caught her peripheral vision. An elderly woman in the front row was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Elsewhere in the room, several guests stood transfixed, their expressions reflecting the emotional journey on which she had taken them. Even Wellington appeared genuinely affected, his earlier embarrassment momentarily forgotten as he surrendered to the artistry. Dr. Bennett watched with a complex mixture of emotions, admiration certainly, but also a hint of remorse for her initial silence, for not immediately acknowledging the accomplished artist in their midst. As Eliza developed the central theme of her composition, she incorporated subtle motifs from spiritual melodies her grandmother had sung to her as a child, connecting her formal training with her personal history. The music built toward its climax, a series of technically demanding passages that required both strength and sensitivity, each note articulated with purpose and precision. The final movement of ancestral echoes was a declaration of presence, not apologetic, not seeking approval, but simply claiming the fullness of her artistic voice. The pianissimo conclusion, delicate yet resonant, hung in the air like a question posed to the universe. For several seconds after the final note faded, no one moved. The silence held the echo of what had just transpired, a collective processing, of witnessing excellence that had appeared unexpectedly in their midst. Excellence they had been prepared to dismiss based on nothing more than prejudice. The final note of Eliza's composition hung in the air like a question suspended between worlds. For 3 heartbeats, silence reigned, a collective inhale before. The room erupted in applause. Several guests rose to their feet, their expressions a mixture of awe and recalibration. Dr. Claire Bennett moved purposefully through the crowd, positioning herself beside the piano. She waited for the applause to subside before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of her academic position. "For those who may not be aware, we have been privileged this evening to hear Eliza Johnson, the internationally acclaimed concert pianist." She turned toward Eliza with genuine respect. Ms. Johnson graduated summa cum laude from Juilliard, won the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition, and has performed with the New York Philharmonic, Berlin Philharmonic, and London Symphony Orchestra. Her interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto received the Classical Performance Award last year, and her original compositions have been commissioned by orchestras worldwide. Thomas Wellington stepped forward, his composure partially recovered, though his complexion remained flushed. "Ms. Johnson, that is to say," he cleared his throat, "a remarkable performance. Had I known of your achievements, I would have properly introduced you to my guests." Eliza stood, smoothing her dress as she regarded Wellington with steady eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Wellington. Though I find it interesting that one's achievements should determine the courtesy they receive." Her voice was calm, neither accusatory nor conciliatory. "Throughout my career, I have consistently encountered the assumption that I need to prove my worth before being granted the respect automatically extended to others. The room grew quiet again, the weight of her words settling over the gathering. Music, Eliza continued, like talent and passion, knows no racial boundaries. It exists wherever dedication and opportunity intersect. What it requires is not just recognition, but access. She glanced briefly toward the young waitstaff along the wall, predominantly people of color, before returning her gaze to the predominantly white guests. And perhaps more spaces where excellence is presumed possible from everyone, rather than considered exceptional from some. Dr. Bennett nodded, a mixture of admiration and remorse in her expression. Ms. Johnson, Boston University, is hosting the Meridian Concert Series next month. We would be honored if you would consider performing as our featured soloist. A small group of guests approached with business cards and genuine questions about her work. An elderly patron engaged her in a conversation about her composition techniques, while a young music student hovered nearby, clearly hoping for a moment of Eliza's attention. Across the room, Sophia Hartley stood against the wall, her social confidence visibly diminished. She observed the admiration now directed toward Eliza, but made no move to join the circle of conversations. 4 months later, Eliza sat before a different piano on the stage of Jordan Hall. The sold-out audience included many faces from Wellington's gathering, though their expressions now held anticipation rather than polite dismissal. Thomas Wellington himself sat in the third row, having made a substantial donation to the music education program Eliza had established for underserved communities. In the front row, Marcus watched with undisguised pride, occasionally glancing toward the young black girl seated beside him with her parents. The child, no more than 12, leaned forward whenever Eliza's hands moved across the keys, her eyes wide with possibility. As Eliza launched into her newly composed piece, she reflected on how her talent had served as both shield and bridge throughout her life, protecting her from the worst consequences of prejudice while creating connections that transcended social barriers. Tonight's performance was not about proving herself. That burden had been carried long enough. Instead, it was about creating space, expanding the perimeter of what was assumed possible for those who would come after her. The excellence she pursued was its own form of resistance, transforming prejudice not through confrontation, but through undeniable evidence of what could flourish when talent was recognized, nurtured, and celebrated regardless of its origin. As her composition reached its pinnacle, Eliza glanced again at the young girl in the front row, recognizing in her expression the same hunger that had once driven her own fingers to practice until they ached. The true resolution, Eliza knew, would come when that child could simply play, her gift acknowledged without first requiring extraordinary proof of its existence.